All right, good morning. So we are starting on Module 11, which is just a continuation of our Unit 4, all about evolution and classification. So last week, we talked a little bit about natural selection and a little bit about evolution. This week, we are getting into something referred to as classification. All right, so basically, before we start, let's kind of talk about where do different species get their names. So you've heard that humans are called Homo sapiens, but where exactly did we get that name from? So in this particular hook section, it talks about where before a new species can be named, it actually has to be confirmed as newly identified. So this is done through consultation with different people, with experts, through examination of related species, through DNA tests. And the scientists who discovered the species must then select a Latin name following certain rules. So these names can be commemorative, so named after a particular famous person. It can be descriptive, such as the red maple tree, which was named after the way that it looks in the fall. It could be geographical, so there's a particular possum named after the state of Virginia, which is where it was found. It could be nonsensical, so basically there is a large plant that is actually named after a spell in the Harry Potter series because it seemingly appears out of nowhere. So it just depends on who's naming it, which scientist discovers it, and what they kind of want to do with that. All right, so let's kind of talk about how organisms to begin with got all of these different levels of classification, or how we identify these different species. So Aristotle is credited with the very first true classification system. All right, and he basically grouped all living things into two basic groups. He said that every single thing on Earth that was living was either a plant or an animal. All right, then Linnaeus came along and further classified plants and animals by dividing them into related groups. And he used the Latin language because Latin was actually no longer spoken conversationally and therefore was less likely to change. So we weren't going to get any slang terms or anything like that because Latin was basically a dead language at that point. All right, so he first grouped organisms and he called this the genus. So for example, anything that is dog-like, we're basically grouped into the genus Canis. All right, so then he gave every different type of organism in the group a specific name, which he called a species. So for example, the dog became Canis familiaris and the wolf became Canis lupus. So notice that the genus is always capitalized. So genus is capitalized, but the species always begins with a lowercase letter. So very similar to the way that you write your own name. So notice that both are italicized and underlined whenever we write them. All right, so very similarly up here, they are italicized or underlined to represent that name. All right. So when we start talking about this genus and species, every organism was then given that two-part name, like Canis familiaris or Canis lupus. All right, this is the practice of binomial nomenclature. Remember, the root word bi means two, nomen means name, so this is a two-part naming system. All right, so the benefit of this binomial nomenclature basically includes eliminating confusion and allow scientists around the world to more easily communicate. So across all of these different languages, we know that the Latin word for a basic house dog or domesticated dog would be Canis familiaris. All right, so when we start looking at these side margin boxes, our history of classification, Linnaeus only used two kingdoms. All right, so he used the two that Aristotle originally said and basically broke it down from plant and animal. Whitaker came along and then expanded it into 5 kingdoms. Today, we use 6 kingdoms, so we upped it a little bit in there. All right, so 2, 5, and 6. So it went from originally just plant and animal up to a little bit more, up to the 6 kingdoms that we have today, including fungi, archaeobacteria, eubacteria, all the little microorganisms as well. So this is all a result of after the microbial world was being discovered. Okay, so it wasn't until 1969 that Whitaker actually expanded it to those 5 kingdoms. So relatively recent if you're really thinking about it. All right, so within the science of classification, we use something called taxonomy. And this taxonomy is basically what helps scientists to assign these 7 levels of classification, or taxa, to these living organisms. So let's look at the human, for example. We are animals, so we fall within kingdom Animalia. Our phylum is Chordata, meaning that we have a spinal cord or a chordate. We are mammals, meaning that we give birth to live young. Primates, Hominidae, Homo sapien. Okay, so notice that when we write out the binomial nomenclature, we're only using the genus and the species. All right, so a human would be written as Homo sapien. The dog, like mentioned earlier, would be written as Canis familiaris. Notice once again that the genus is always capitalized and the species is always lowercase. All right, so this goes from very broad categorization to very, broad specific categorization. All right, so the kingdom is the broadest, and then we are going down to the most specific, which is the species. And this is actually how we classify whether animals are related to each other as well. So notice that Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, Carnivora, Canidae, all of these up to this point, and actually up to genus, would mean that the dog and the wolf are related. The only thing that's different is the species. So Canis lupus would be a wolf, whereas the dog would be Canis familiaris. All right, so once again, species most specific, kingdom is the most general or the most broad. All right, today we actually use something above kingdom, which is a domain. So these 3 domains are then subdivided into the 6 kingdoms. So the kingdoms Eubacteria, Archaeobacteria, Protista, Plantae, Fungi, and Animalia. All right, in this chart, it also gives you examples of what would fall within that particular category. So when we start talking about classifying organisms, we can use a little tool, and it is one of my favorite things to work with. It is called a dichotomous key. All right, and a dichotomous key is basically just a tool that uses a series of paired statements and the visible characteristics of an organism. So something that you can actually see on the outside. All right, so the little rules are as follows, and there are only 4. You always start at statement 1, which is at the beginning. All right, then you decide which path best describes the organism, either statement A or statement B. Then you follow that path and go to the next choice. So it will say go to blank. When you can go no further, you will find the name. So let's do one that we definitely know the name for, just so that we can check it. Okay, so let's do organism number 4. We know what this is. You can tell that that is clearly a frog, okay? So let's look at our dichotomous key and figure out how to get to the name frog. All right, so we're always going to start at statement number 1, which is right here. All right, so it says statement number 1, option A or B. The organism is a plant or the organism is an animal. Well, we know that a frog is an animal, all right? So we're going to go to number 3. So we're going to bounce down all the way to statement number 3. All right, does this organism have wings or not have wings? Okay, well, it doesn't have wings. We can tell by it, and it says go to 4. So we're going to go down to statement number 4. Our options are has webbed feet, which would be an amphibian or a frog. Okay, or not webbed feet, which would be something like a muskrat. Well, we know that it is a amphibian. It has webbed feet. We can see it in this picture. All right, so organism number 4 is a frog. All right, so if we wanted to go through and do, say, let's do statement number 2, okay? Or, animal number 2. All right, so animal number 2, let's start at statement number 1. Is it a plant or an animal? We know it's an animal. We're gonna go to 3. So dropping down, does it have wings? Does it not have wings? It does have wings. Therefore, organism number 2 is identified as a mosquito. All right, so dichotomous keys are fun. They take a little bit of practice with them, but they are awesome to work with. All right, let's kind of talk about some of these different big terms on the next page. All right, so when an organism has not been classified, taxonomists must begin the process of classification. So they use a couple different modern tools, such as morphology, which is describing the physical appearance or physical characteristics of an organism. Typically, this is really enough information to place us in a domain in a kingdom. So for example, the presence of a nucleus in a cell of an organism says, okay, well, this is a eukaryotic cell. We talked about this when we talked about cells. It's going to go in the domain eukarya. All right. DNA and biochemical analysis allow scientists to actually test the less visible but distinguishing characteristics. So for example, they can stay in a bacterial cell and they can actually allow the scientists to distinguish whether it is an archaea or prokaryotic cell. All right, and then comparing embryology is another one. So it's allowing scientists to actually group organisms that share common fetal development. All right, so these particular organisms being shown are related, and you can tell because at the embryological development stages, they look very similar. So across stage 1, they look pretty similar. Across stage 2, once again, look pretty similar. And then we can see who looks a little bit more similar as we kind of go through. So notice that this one and this one look a little bit more similar than, say, this one and this one, meaning that these two were probably more closely related, and these two organisms are probably more closely related in ancient history. All right, evolutionary phylogeny actually describes the evolutionary relationships between organisms. So these relationships are basically deduced based on shared traits that have been passed from ancestor to new species. So these traits can basically include physical traits, so the presence of jaws, think about sharks, or maybe genetic traits, such as shared genes. And these relationships can actually be illustrated in something called a phylogenetic tree or a cladogram. So let's flip to the next page and check out what that cladogram looks like. And these are actually really cool and really interesting. So this is an evolutionary family tree. So in this particular cladogram, let's go through it and see which one is the most closely related to each other. So when we're looking at a tree, the branches on this particular diagram are going to show what is more closely related to something else. So starting here, this is the beginning of time basically, and this is modern. So through the process of evolution, we start to see the development of different types of organisms. All right, so the first question says in this cladogram, what kingdom is most closely related to animals? Well, animals is right here. The next closest kingdom is fungi. So our kingdom fungi is actually most closely related to animals. All right, what kingdom evolved first? Well, when we start to see this, our kingdom that evolved first, our very first one all the way to the left, and that is our bacteria. All right, then it asks us, from what kingdom did plants evolve? Well, protists are right here, and we see that we have a little branch coming off of the protist line to our plants. All right, therefore, plants evolved from kingdom Protista, or the protist kingdom.